I'd like to welcome you here at Yahweh's Restoration Ministry. I'm here today in our library, beautiful library as you can see. Today I want to talk a little bit about our recent pilgrimage to the land of Israel, the Holy Land, a really remarkable place. We saw about 30 sites. So let me just share with you some of the locations we saw just real quick. I'm not going to go through each one of these, I'm not going to describe each one of these, but really phenomenal locations. Number one was Ceaserea Maritima. This is halfway between Tel Aviv and Haifa, beautiful place right near the Mediterranean Sea. We also saw a place called Megiddo, Tel Megiddo. You'll probably recognize this as Armageddon. This is where all the armies of the earth will gather before they will attack Jerusalem, Mount Carmel. Beautiful, beautiful location. Someone on the trip said it actually looks like Colorado. I was really amazed at the terrain and just how pretty it was. But as we know, this is where Elijah defeated the prophets of Baal. We also saw Capernaum, which, by the way, they corrected me. They told me that the correct pronunciation is Capernaum. Kafir means village, and Nahum is the person it's named after. By the way, it's not the prophet Nahum. Also, some of the other locations. One of the things we did, which was really amazing, is we went on a boat ride on the Sea of Galilee, and the guy that was on the captain, I guess, he was a Messianic believer, and he actually got up and sang, both in English and Hebrew. And that was really memorable to watch that. Tel Dan. I want to come back to Tel Dan because I want to talk about a lesson there in Tel Dan. But Tel Dan sits right along the Syrian-Lebanese border, and really an amazing site. Caesarea Philippi, this is where Peter first acknowledged that Joshua was the Messiah. We also saw Hazor. This goes back to the time of Joshua, and actually we see ruins there that would have been the result of Israel during that time under Joshua. We also went down to the south. We saw Qumran, the Dead Sea, Gomorrah. And Gomorrah was really phenomenal because we actually see there the result of when we turn away from our Father's word. You know, we know the story. You know, they committed immorality, and their sin came to a full, and Yahweh said enough, and he removed that city from all of history, and we still see that it's just ash today. It really is amazing. We also saw Masada. Now, after Masada, after the south, we went up to Jerusalem, and of course we saw many, many sites in Jerusalem. Here's just a few. We saw the Garden Tomb. Many Protestants believe that this is where Yahshua was buried and also resurrected. I don't know if there's really archaeological proof to support that, but it is a really pretty site. Of course, the Mount of Olives is a very prophetic site, a very important site. We know that Yahshua is going to come back to the Mount of Olives, and something, you know, as believers, very, very important when you're there. It's just remarkable when you're standing on top of that mountain and you can see the city of Jerusalem, and also know that this is, again, where Yahshua is going to come. Scripture talks about how the entire valley will split, and matter of fact, they've actually found a fault line there. It really is amazing what the science is always proving what we find scripturally. Also saw the Garden of Gethsemane, the house of Caiaphas. And the house of Caiaphas, if you ever go, it really is an amazing sight because you can actually see the room where they would have kept Yahshua, and actually even where they would have punished and whipped Yahshua at his house. But we saw many other locations in the city of Jerusalem. I'm not going to go through all of them. But I do want to go back and talk a little bit about Tel Dan. You know, Tel Dan is one of my favorite sites in the land of Israel. It's a beautiful site, number one. But number two, it's really the scriptural lesson we find there at Tel Dan. We know in Tel Dan, this is where Jeroboam put the golden calf and caused Israel to sin and turn against Yahweh. And you know, it's amazing too, because Yahweh told Jeroboam in the beginning, he says, look, if you follow me, you're going to be blessed. Now we know in the end that Jeroboam did not follow him. In the end, Jeroboam, to save his own neck, decided to change and compromise Yahweh's worship. He did that in a few ways. Number one, he made a feast in his own time instead of the Feast of Tabernacles on the 7th month, 15th day. He appointed a feast in the 8th month, and so that's not something we should be doing as believers. We cannot dictate when we worship Yahweh, and that's something, a lesson just in itself. Also, we know that he committed idolatry by putting up the golden calf, and he also, it says he established the priests from the lowest of the people, and that's something we're not to do either, because Scripture says that a bishop or an elder must be above reproach. and that wasn't the case. So again, he really did some very awful things, and because of that, we know that the history of Israel just did not end well. Everybody after Jeroboam, every other king following Jeroboam, it says, did evil in Yahweh's sight. So he set a real poor pattern that Israel never recovered from. But again, going back to what this man did, he set up this golden calf, and he told Israel, look, don't go down to Jerusalem, don't bother going down there, worship here. And he replaced Yahweh with these golden calves. And I think this is a really good sight for this time of year, because what we see is a holiday known as Christmas. And this actually goes back to sun worship. This goes back to Rome, and actually even further back, because we know it goes back to Saturnalia, this worship of Saturn. This was a 7-day observance during the time of Rome that actually give gifts and do other things that we continue to see today during the Christmas time. And we also know that it comes from a time or an observance from Mithraism. Mithraism worshipped Mithra, and Mithra was worshipped predominantly by men and really the military, very popular. And that goes all the way back, by the way, to ancient Persia. And then you have something called Sol Invictus, open unconquered sun. And this was another observance in Rome that was observed on December 25th. And it was dedicated to the sun. And what's amazing is that, many people know this today and they just don't care. They think, we can meddle and change Yahweh's worship and do what we want. And that's not the case. Yahweh says, look, this is how you're to worship me. He's given us feast days. Of course, he's also appointed the Sabbath is a day of rest and a day that we're to come together and worship and fellowship. And, if we adopt pagan worship, we're in violation of his word. And again, I think that's a great example of what we find at Tel Dan, because there in Tel Dan, that's precisely what Jeroboam did. And we know that it did not end well for Jeroboam, did not end well for Israel, and it will not end well for those of us who goes against our Father's word. And so there's a great lesson there from Jeroboam and from this location known as Tel Dan. And I would encourage you to really, think about what you're doing when it comes to worshiping your Father in heaven, and make sure that you're worshiping him as we find within his word, because nothing is more, listen, nothing is more important than worshiping Yahweh as he defines within his word. And again, we see really an abomination this time of year, and that is, again, Christmas. And I'm not going to repeat myself, but this goes back to pagan Rome. And Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 10, verses 2 through 5, it talks about tree worship. Now, this is not to the Christmas tree, but nonetheless, the Christmas tree is tree worship. And there in Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 2, Yahweh says they will learn not the way of the heathen. So that's a lesson for us, is we're not to learn the way of the heathen. In other words, we're not to learn how other nations and other religions worship their deities or their mighty ones. We're to worship Yahweh as he defines within his word, and when we don't, again, we're in violation of his word, and we're going to be judged for that. So, the lesson here, again, from the land of Israel, one of the great lessons, and by the way, there are so many great lessons from the land of Israel. That's the amazing thing about Israel is no matter where you go, no matter what site you visit, there's always a scriptural lesson to be found. And I mean, you can find lessons going all the way back to Joshua, and you can certainly find many lessons in the New Testament, Joshua and the apostles, and what they taught. But here, again, in Tel Dan, we have this site that you can actually see the altar. You can see the platform where they would have put the golden calf, and you can see where they would have worshipped. And it really is an abomination. Now, before closing, and hopefully we can get some footage of this on the screen for you, but one thing that I really found phenomenal, I did not see in 2014 at the site of Tel Dan, was called Abraham's Gate. And this gate goes back to the time of Abraham, which is really unthinkable if you consider that. But suppose, many people believe that Abraham would have walked through this gate when Lot was captured. So we know that the Bible does mention that he was in the area of Tel Dan. So just a remarkable site, as so many sites are in Israel. Well, I'd like to thank you for joining me today. I pray this has been good for you, has been a blessing to you. And again, I would just encourage everyone watching this to really study, to ensure that what you're doing is honoring Yahweh, because so many people today, they think they're honoring Yahweh. They think that they're doing it Yahweh's way. What we see is they're doing it man's way. And we should never do it man's way. Yahweh doesn't want us to worship him according to man's ways. He wants us to worship him according to his ways. So I would encourage you to really keep that in mind, and make sure that you're worshiping Yahweh as he defines. And again, when it comes to things like Christmas and Easter and Halloween and and even Sunday worship, that we just avoid those like the plague, and that we worship Yahweh as He defines within His Word. Until next time, may Yahweh bless you.